And I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much. Madam President, we are grateful to Mr. Ging for his briefing. In many areas of Syria, the situation has stabilized. The efforts of the authorities have contributed to creating conditions for a dignified and safe return of refugees and internally displaced persons. The Syrian government has called on their fellow citizens to come home and participate in the reconstruction of the country after the destructive conflict. It has provided guarantees of security and safety. Law number 10, as Damascus has continued to explain, is not aimed at undermining property rights. A series of measures has been developed that provides for facilitating passport and customs control, social and medical care, assistance in education and employment, and preferential credit. At the same time, with the support of Russian experts, efforts are continuing at demining, clearing debris, and repairing infrastructure. Overall, 93 medical and 226 educational facilities have been restored. 318 kilometers of roads have been repaired. 242 kilometers of electrical transmission lines have been laid. 88 electrical switching stations have been made operational. 72 water supply sites, 2 oil wells, and 2 fuel and energy complexes. In 118 towns of the provinces of Aleppo, Damascus, Deir el-Zor, Latakia, Hamas, and Homs, work is going to restore 82 schools, 56 preschool institutions, 58 bakeries, 59 pumping stations, 54 electrical switching stations, 50 medical institutions, and over half a thousand of residential buildings. Russia has created a center for receiving, processing, and housing refugees in Syria, which has provided information on towns that are ready to receive people. The process of the return of Syrians to their homes is gaining ground. Overall, since September of 2015, over 238,000 refugees have returned to Syria from abroad, and over 1.2 million internally displaced persons. Starting in July of this year, over 9,000 refugees have returned, mainly from, first and foremost, from Lebanon and Jordan. The 412 towns have established centers for reception centers for placement of some 1.5 million individuals. It is quite clear that there is a need to step up efforts to support the Syrian side in restoring damaged infrastructure. It is unacceptable to put forward artificial demands that will only complicate this process. It is high time to heed the UN's own assessment about the damaging impact of unilateral sanctions on the life of ordinary citizens and to refrain from these inhumane measures. A very important role in the process of returning of Syrians to their homes should be played by the UN, first and foremost by the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. So far, this office has adopted a fairly passive position, possibly because of an internal directive of the UN Secretariat that was developed at the end of last year by its Department of Political Affairs without consulting with member states. This directive does exist, in spite of the clumsy attempts to refute this fact. This directive hinders the involvement of United Nations structures and efforts to restore Syria until political changes are effected in this country. What does this remind us of? Well, this is word for word the well-known politicized position of key Western countries, which for some reason the Secretariat has adopted as its final word. This irresponsible approach, which runs counter to the neutral posture of the UN, must be revised immediately. At the same time, we were surprised to what extent the Office of the High Commissioner of Refugees expeditiously provided assistance in Jordan to the activists of White Helmets that were evacuated by their sponsors from Syria. So it turns out that ordinary Syrians that want to return to their home don't deserve assistance, whereas those who abet extremists by pretending to be humanitarian actors are welcomed with open arms. These kinds of double standards do not enhance the credibility of the international organization. We agree that the situation in Idlib deserves our particular attention. The priority task continues to be separating the moderate opposition from the terrorists. In Idlib, we see concentrated forces of Jihad al-Nusra, which are trying to lead and submit other groups under their leadership, other groups that are interested in national reconciliation. The terrorists have detained some 2,000 unreliable individuals, which they continue consider as allies of reaching an agreement with the Syrian authorities. We're seeing constant provocations against the Syrian army and the civilians in areas that are abutting the de-escalation zones. Just in August, the positions of government forces were shelled 383 times by mortars, anti-aircraft batteries, and heavy caliber machine guns. 21 soldiers and 10 civilians were killed. Residential neighborhoods of Aleppo have been shelled. We have shot down 45 drones that were launched against the airbase of Khmeinin. And they are used not only for intelligence gathering, but often they carry a munitions payload. These trends will be countered. We call on the commanders of illegal armed formations to refrain from provocations and to engage the path of peaceful resolution. That possibility continues to exist. However, the current status quo is unacceptable. The United States has illegally, in violation of the Syrian sovereignty, has created on the south of the country an Taif air base. In its area of security, there's a refugee camp, Rugban, which is located. There, in that refugee camp, hundreds of terrorists of IGIL and Nusra feel quite safe there, and they carry out raids against liberated areas. The delivery of humanitarian assistance to that camp has not been set up yet. We hope that this situation will be resolved. Unfortunately, in the report of the Secretary General, not enough due attention is paid to the situation around Rugban. Furthermore, the neo-colonial, in essence, policy to divide the country is continued, where in the northeast of the country, with the support of the coalition, quasi-state structures that have pledged allegiance to the coalition have been established. We see increasing number of military sites that are supported by the coalition. There's clear evidence of a consolidated terrorist presence in the country and attempts to gain control over the country's resources. This runs counter to statements that the only goal of the military presence in the country is to combat ISIL. At the July meeting on the humanitarian situation in Syria, there was particular focus on the protection of children. Some delegations said all the right words about what were the priority tasks to deal with, including providing psychological rehabilitation of children, ensuring normal conditions for their going to school. This was certainly encouraging, and we started asking colleagues, well, what kind of steps did they intend to take to help Syrian children? Well, to our surprise, it turned out that they didn't plan to take any steps. In other words, the goal was to simply draw attention to the issue. So to make noise and to draw attention, to make a show of being humane to the audience, that's not necessary. The Syrians know about their problems better than anyone else. What's necessary is concrete assistance. Madam President, you as a president of the Security Council, before the start of the meeting, I you made the following statement to the press. I will quote it in part. We all remember the risk of possible chemical attacks. All these issues will be discussed during the meeting of the Security Council. The Russian Ministry of Defense has made a statement on this subject. I believe that this is an incredibly fake story, even by the standards of Russian propaganda. These statements by the Ministry of Defense are absurd and comical. We are not preparing any chemical attacks. We think it would be better if the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian government would use its influence to convince Assad not to use chemical weapons and not to attack his own population. Well, the Ministry of Defense of Russia is not used to make fake and absurd and comical statements. Maybe ministries of defense of other countries are wont to do this, but certainly not the Russian one. If the Ministry of Defense says something, that it says that based on concrete facts. Let me tell you a little bit about this statement, and you will decide for yourself whether it's comical or not. In Syria, another provocation is being prepared with the use of chemical weapons. Terrorists of Jabhat al-Nusra, who have occupied the Idlib province, are interested in stopping the government army and are counting on further actions of intimidation by the United States and its allies against Damascus. Now, it's hard to consider just a coincidence the fact that in the news recently, the most repulsive leaders of the terrorists, al-Baghdadi and al-Giuliani, have made their appearance. According to reports that in the Idlib town of Jisr al-Shugur, 8 containers of chlorine were delivered. They were moved to the village of Haluz, where the white helmets delivered to a large amount of chemical weapons. Then part of the chemicals, unmarked chemicals, were transferred to unmarked vehicles and were transferred to the southern part of Idlib province. In the Idlib town of Jiz al-Shur, 8 containers were delivered. Then they were transferred to the Haluz village, where a special group delivered, which was supposed to stage delivering first aid to victims of chemical weapons. The Syrian side has informed the members of the Security Council and the 1540 Committee about this. The group underwent training on handling chemical weapons under the leadership of specialists of a British private company, Oliva. The provocation with the active participation of Western intelligence services is meant to serve as a pretext for the Western Troika to conduct missile and airstrikes against the military infrastructure of Syria, as in the past. I think we have all noticed statements at the highest level in Washington, Paris, and London about the readiness to conduct a harsh response. At the same time, they're threatening even more large-scale actions, probably recalling that after the April aggression, they stated that the alleged chemical capacity of the regime was completely destroyed at the time. It's not by chance that destroyer Salivans has arrived in the Persian Gulf. It is armed with 56 cruise missiles, or the fact that in the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, a U.S. Air Force bomber with 24 cruise missiles arrived. So in other words, we are being warned. At the same time, in the Arab news outlets, there have been reports that cases of abduction of children from villages in Idlib have increased. Probably these children will be used for the stage episodes directed by the West white helmets and funded by their Western sponsors. The Syrian armed forces do not have chemical weapons and have no plans to use them. There is no military need for that. We have stated this more than once. People in their right minds will not use means that are useless from a military point of view in order to trigger reprisals by 3 major powers. But of course, the publicity about what is expected provocation could lead to could unleash the strikes. Thank you for this warning of your response. We want to also warn you that we're absolutely aware of your unsavory plans. We strongly suggest that you refrain from them. Carrying out these plans will further deliver a strike against a peaceful resolution in Syria. We're seeing how some Western countries are more clearly supporting Jihad al-Nusra and sticking up for the terrorists. The chemical topic is crudely manipulated to put pressure on Damascus and just saber rattling to deal with internal domestic issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Protocol requires me to thank the Russian representative for his statement.